Welcome. I'm having a conversation here with Dr. Todd McGowan, an expert on Hegelian philosophy, and specifically interested to talk to him about his new book, Emancipation After Hegel. Um, you know, I've known of Todd's work for a few years now, and also been aware of the conferences you've been putting on with the LAT conference and some of the work you've been doing with other philosophers on sort of connecting Hegel to modern thought. So why don't you introduce yourself first and sort of maybe give an overview of Emancipation After Hegel, then we can get into the meat of it.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. So I guess I teach at the University of Vermont. I've been interested in Hegel since I was in graduate school. I was in graduate school at Ohio State in the 90s, and Hegel was always a key thinker for me, but my first early work was more on psychoanalysis. So one of the things that I've tried to do, and this sort of follows the figure of Slavoj Žižek, who I think has been important to me as a thinker. I've tried to bring together Hegel and psychoanalysis. I do that somewhat. I have a chapter on that in Emancipation After Hegel. And that book, I wrote it 2 years ago, and it took a long time I spent a long time writing it, and actually about a third of it got cut out just because it was too long. So it was originally about 200,000 words long, and it had to get a little excision done to it. But the idea was that I wanted to, first of all, refute this idea that Hegel is a philosopher of synthesis. So that's one of the main things that I had in mind, although other people have done that. So the other thing that I wanted to think through was his relationship to contradiction. And my idea was that actually what Hegel calls absolute knowing or the absolute idea is a reconciliation with the inevitability, the intractability of contradiction. And so that was the main through line of my thinking in that book. And then I looked at these different Hegelian ideas like end of history, the things that people tend to slam Hegel for. I tried to look at anew in the light of this idea that his driving force is to reconcile us with contradiction, not to overcome it. So that's basically where I was coming from in the book and what I was trying to do.
All right, that's super helpful summary. So I'm not sure if you know, but right now I'm sort of leading my own little return to Freud, where I'm revisiting the original Freudian texts. And one of the things that stuck out to me from one of his first papers on psychical treatment from 1890 is that he's specifically focused on the parent-child bond and the bond between two devoted lovers. Like he's specifically from the very beginning focused on these two bonds.
Uh-huh.
And in my experience and my sort of own struggles in life with contradiction, they appear here at intimate relationships, parent-child relationships, where in my experience, there's this desire for perfect identity, to get rid of contradiction, to overcome contradiction, say contradiction between man and woman, contradiction between parent and child, things like this. And I know that in one of your presentations on this book, you sort of say that Hegel would have been understood better if he was writing after Freud.
Yeah.
So I wonder here, how does this emphasis that you're putting on contradiction and deepening contradiction allow us to be in these types of relationships with sort of almost, I don't know if the right word is wisdom, but that word's coming to my mind.
Right.
Like this relationship between perfect identity and contradictory identity.
Right. So I think how Hegel is helpful even for me personally, I think the way he's helpful is that he allows us to see that the disruption within the relationship, the problems that occur in the relationship, are themselves actually can be indications of the productivity or the passion or the health even of the relationship. And so I think that for me is a really helpful way to think about things. The other thing, just to connect with Freud for a second, I think that the Freudian notion of death drive is very important to me, and that I think that Hegel, he doesn't have an idea of that, but I do think that his sense of contradiction is proximate to that Freudian notion. So I think Freud really is great about how within these, just like you're describing, these intimate relationships, something destructive is in there, and that actually, it's not just what will undo the relationships, it also is what actually sustains them. And so I think that is really, and I think that very contradictory idea is a Hegelian idea. And so for me, that's one of the ways in which they come together, and that's also something that Hegel has really taught me, I guess I would say.
When you say sort of that in these intimate relationships, what undoes them also sustains them. It kind of reminds me of something Alenka Zupancic said about the poison being the cure.
Right.
This type of way in which what we think is sort of the external obstacle or enemy is the very thing sustaining our present identity, or something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right to say that this is true even in actual physical existence as well, right? Like we're trying to inoculate a bunch of people for a disease right now, and they're inoculating them with the disease. So I think it's a fascinating, I mean, it just, to me, that shows that what Hegel's getting at is right.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that the entire way in which, like, to think the logic of the vaccination is kind of, we're using that logic.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
exactly. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. So fascinating.
Yeah.
So you sort of say like that contradiction is like an engine of movement. Mm-hmm. It's like this engine of movement. I wanted to like go into like maybe deeper, like, and I'll just to ground it in something that, the quote that you have of Hegel, it's the thought of contradiction is the essential moment of the concept. Yeah. I thought that's such a powerful quote.
It's a great line. Yeah.
So I'm glad that you sort of highlighted that and brought it front and center. And in these sort of the problems people have in their intimate relationships or their family life, and even in love in general, I feel like there's this I don't know, it's this frustration with the continuation of movement. Mm-hmm. That things keep moving, that you like that there's time, basically.
Right.
And so I almost feel like if you can, so the relevance of Hegel with the thought of the contradiction is the essential moment of the concept, is that once you emotionally integrate that, you almost become a different type of human. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's really good. And it's interesting to me, I think it's maybe the middle chapter of the book is on love and Hegel. And it's interesting that Hegel developed his conception of the concept out of his idea of love, right? And so that really is, I think you're right to say that really creates a different kind of, a different kind of humanity, a different kind of relationality that you develop once you grasp the central role of contradiction within love or within the concept, right? Like that, I think you're right to point to that as really a key idea in what Hegel's getting at. And then if you can integrate that into your practice, your way of being, then I think that does really fundamentally change you, because it makes you view obstacles differently, right? Like you don't feel like obstacles are solely obstacles. They're also things that draw you in and things that you actually find satisfaction in. So for me, I think that turn is really crucial. And I also think that that's kind of the psychoanalytic turn as well. Like that's what psychoanalysis is also advocating. That's one of the points I see a connection between them.
And I think that topic brings us to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is religion. Yeah. And you make some points about religion, specifically Hegel's notion of Christianity, and if I could connect that to what we just discussed about love and motion, one of the things I noticed that you might appreciate is that when I talk to a lot of monks, specifically, I went to some Buddhist temples.
Yeah,
I find that a lot of them become monks because of a catastrophe of love.
Mm-hmm.
I interpret it as kind of like this withdrawal from the symbolic order, or this withdrawal from conceptualization. I would go to the urinals and they would have this sign above the urinal that would say, concepts are just in your mind. Like it's not, they're not a big deal. Like don't worry about the concepts. And at the same time, there's this again, this motion that I feel like we have to reconcile ourselves with. And I think that, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on Hegel and Christianity, and maybe how it's a different approach to religious experience than the Buddhist meditative practice.
Yeah, I mean, Hegel would never say concepts are just in your mind, for instance. Like he was very opposed to this idea of the withdrawal from the world. And in fact, he has some very derisive things to say about monks. And he uses the term monkish as a slur. So if he says you're a monkish figure, he's insulted you in a way that he is at the height of his insulting power. But I think that the key thing, like for him, actually, what he likes about Christianity is that he thinks it's not a monkish religion, in the sense that it wants to get out into the world and spread itself out. And he thinks that the way in which God is conceived in Christianity is it's akin to the highest philosophical thinking, because the moment he thinks when Christ dies on the cross, we get, in Hegel's mind, the infinite God coming down, the absolute beyond, coming down to earth and dying and being in this most humiliated figure. So for him, the humiliation, the absolute humiliation of Christ is absolutely necessary, because that indicates how far down God has gone. So I think, I just said it, he would not like monks, but I think like the way in which St. Francis lived his life with this, absolute abasement and total impoverishment, giving up everything, and then going out into the people. I think that is in keeping actually with Hegel's idea that you find the divine in this absolute humiliation. And I think I find that a really powerful idea. And that reading, obviously what we see around us today that's called Christianity doesn't bear much resemblance to that. But I think that I still really like that idea of Christianity, that I think is in keeping with the Christian message itself. Like I think that if you read, say, Matthew, I think Hegel really resonates that idea.
I think that obviously, for me, I grew up in the sort of the new atheist culture.
Uh-huh.
There was a wave, right, of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and so forth. Right. And I think that it's kind of Hegelian philosophy in some sense that has opened my eyes to the sort of metaphorical significance. Is that fair? Is that fair? Is that a fair statement? Mm-hmm. The metaphorical significance of these forms that
even I think Hegel would even say philosophical. Like he thinks that his idea, and maybe this is wrong, and I don't know, that he thinks that ordinary people just have too much going on in their lives to spend their time like reading the science of logic or philosophizing. And so his idea is that religion is actually the way in which they philosophize. So his idea is that if they experience Christianity correctly, that is a philosophical experience of this conjunction of the beyond with the here and now. Metaphorical, I don't think that's a problem, but I do think for him it's actually lived out. Like you actually live out this philosophical or speculative experience.
Right. How would that be situated in his triad of the philosophy, art, and religion? So you have philosophy, art, and religion as these paths for the self to discover itself.
Right. The paths to the absolute, what he would say.
Paths of the absolute.
Yeah. So what he would say is that the limitation for him, and I'm not sure if I accept this about art, because I think that he misses the way in which art can maybe at times get something that philosophy can't get. But leave that aside. He thinks that art and religion remain, both of them, stuck in the realm of representation, whereas philosophy can use concepts to get at the absolute. And so he thinks that it is beyond them in that sense. Like it's language is beyond the medium of art or the medium of religion, because they're stuck in. So for him, representation, the German word is Vorstellung, that representation is always limited. Like it can't go as far as conceptual thinking can go. So that's so they are limited. Those of that triad, philosophy is the leader, but the other ones think the same thing. They just do it in a different form, and the form is limited.
Okay, I actually had no idea. It does now. It makes sense to me that he thinks that because he's a philosopher.
Right.
I think Schelling was more on the side of art.
Absolutely,
no?
That's absolutely correct. Like Schelling believes that art goes beyond philosophy. That is true, and I think I don't usually agree with Schelling in his disputes with Hegel, but on this one, I kind of take the side of Schelling. Although as you can tell by my hesitation, I feel a little divided about it because I do see Hegel's point, but I think that, I mean, Hegel had no experience of modern art, so I think that, I mean, Schelling didn't either, but I think that he didn't really see the way in which art has this ability to do something that maybe philosophy can't.
Okay, I mean, I think it'll be like a lifetime of thinking about it for me to like decide what I think about it.
I know. That's how I feel too. Yeah.
But it's nonetheless it's an interesting provocation, and where I find, and I feel like I'll always be too biased by where I situate myself in the triad, because I feel like my natural proclivity tendency is to philosophize.
I know.
So I always want to catch myself because I want to be quick to say, well, yeah, maybe philosophy does stand out.
I know, I feel that too, and I sort of have this philosophical bias like you do, but I like listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and I think, yeah, I don't know. I think that maybe goes beyond what any philosophy gets at. Although it's interesting I always find Beethoven an interesting figure relative to Hegel because they're almost exact contemporaries, and neither one ever mentions the other, and they were both incredibly famous. So it's Hegel talks about he has in the aesthetics, he talks about music. So he talks about Mozart and Rossini actually was his favorite composer. So, he does talk about music, but nothing about Beethoven. So it's interesting that the one musician who is creating music kind of like what Hegel's doing in philosophy doesn't get a mention. So I don't know. But I like you, I don't really have I can't make a decision on that.
Okay. But this notion that you're saying about, at least Hegel's understanding of philosophy, where he's saying art and religion are a little more limited than philosophy. I feel like that brings us directly to this, to me, super important transition between Kant and Hegel and reason and understanding. Because it's kind of such an act of genius to basically take Kant's critique of pure reason, and whereas Kant sees it as a negative feature, he kind of sees it as an enabling feature.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. To me, that's his great move, right? Like that's the great move, is to see reason. The German word is Vernunft. To see reason as the things that Kant finds bad about it, that it constantly runs into these contradictions, to instead see that as like, that's what's so great about our ability to reason. I just think that like no one else made that move. And I think that's one of those times where it's just the singularity of a certain thinker that allows her or him to be able to do that. And I think this is one of those times. So I'm totally with you. I think it's an amazing point, and just that turn is, and I think it actually is the turn that separates today even analytic from continental philosophy in the world. So a lot of people even today wouldn't make that turn with Hegel, that they think, that turn, you're just going too far, it's too crazy. And so I feel like and there are analytic Hegelian philosophers who don't even think that's the turn that he made. So it's I think it's such a pivotal point.
It seems to be a pivotal point also between the two cultures in general. I'm even tempted to say, there's this tendency among, I come from, I was from the evolutionary sciences and biological anthropology and stuff like that. And I see that for a lot of people on the more scientific end, there's this tendency to be okay with, like, they're okay with Hume, they're okay with Kant, but then it kind of stops, like, let's not go to Fichte, not go to Schelling, let's not go to Hegel. That's, you get into subjectivist illusions or something like that.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Right. Like Fichte, you're right that Fichte is really the turning point, but nobody really knows him. So it's more Hegel that's the explicit turning point. But you're absolutely right that Fichte is, no one goes to Fichte.
But I wanna get your opinion on this, because it's sort of a representation of sort of my path and like why I'm interested in Hegel. Is like I realized, retroactively, that in university I was interested in origins, like the origin of time, the origin of humanity, the origin of mind, the origin of life. I was interested in big metaphysical questions. And I saw science as a tool to do that. And then at the same time, in my own advancement, saw the contradictions with science, you might say. And at the same time, I think that upon studying Hegel and going deeper into philosophy, I feel a desire, I feel a drive to be bold enough to engage with the antinomies of reason. Like, as he's saying, like we should, like philosophy should ask, what is the beginning of time? We don't, mystery of the Big Bang, or the future singularity. Like, I wrote my thesis on the technological singularity, and you reach antinomies of reason,
right,
in this area too. So yeah, to me, Hegel is a call to, engage deeply in those big questions again. What do you think?
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. And I also think he thinks that science can do that. So I think Hegel would be really happy about the development of physics, say, in the 20th and 21st century. Like, I think he would. It's interesting. He didn't believe in evolution, so I think he would have come around on that after Darwin. But because the evolutionary thinkers of his time didn't have, they didn't really have a sophisticated theory about how to explain it, and so it's interesting that he rejected it. But about physics, I think he would be. I mean, I think in certain ways, physics has supported a lot of Hegel's claims. So I think you're absolutely right, and I also think he wouldn't. I think he would resist the way in which philosophy and science is separated so much today. I think he would really, he was the last thinker that really had a whole speculative dimension to his thought and wrote a philosophy of nature and tried to really think about the merits of the philosophical merits of scientific insight. So I think he would want to, as much as possible, sustain those things together.
Okay. So, I mean, one of the interesting things is that in his philosophy, of course, the speculative power of reason is so front and center. And at the same time, it is a process philosophy. It's a historical phenomenology of spirit. So why do you think there's a conflict, or is there really deeply a conflict between, say, the process phenomenology, the process of spirit, and evolutionary thinking? To me, they go nicely together. Where would you see a problem?
Well, I think for him the problem was that, so the process is in a certain way for Hegel illusory, because the point is always for him that we start at the end, right? Like so what he's describing, and there's a Freudian term for this which doesn't really translate well. So it's retroactivity, or I think in French they translate it as après coup, and the German term is Nachträglichkeit. And I think that Hegel is really a philosopher of retroactivity or Nachträglichkeit. And so I think the process part, and this is why I think there's a real split between his thinking and phenomenology, because I don't think phenomenology, as it's understood from Husserl on through Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, I think has nothing really to do and is really at odds with Hegel's philosophy. So I would really be hesitant to call him a process philosopher. And I think that's why he was resistant to evolution, because he would say, we always tell the story of evolution from the end of the story, right? And I think that's true even of Darwin as well. I mean, reading Origin of the Species, I mean, obviously I don't question evolutionary insights, but reading Origin of the Species is interesting because when he goes to when Darwin goes to prove natural selection, he uses not wild animals, but animals that are bred by pigeons that are bred by humans. So you were like, well, wait a minute, how are you not describing something that's our activity and not something in the natural that occurs naturally? So I think Hegel would always think about the way in which it's our activity that's shaping what we're seeing, and then that retroactively creates its own past. So I think that would be his basic question for evolutionary type thinking.
Man, I think this is such an important topic to discuss today, because I know for me, I mean, in my training and in my experience in the academy, and what I see definitely among scientists that are, becoming metaphysical in their thinking is, that we live in an evolutionary universe, and that like it's kind of a universal Darwinism. But I do think that what you're emphasizing here, the retroactivity and the way we're always telling the story at the end, I think that there are so many paradoxes here. I think that there's so much interesting thinking here, that needs we need a conference about it.
No, I agree. Like that just that one concept of Nachträglichkeit could be is like infinitely pliable and applicable to so much that's going on. I totally agree with you about that.
Just because it's kind of like the way you're describing it, the way I would frame it is, it's like the subjective act of narrativization itself has to be a part of the evolutionary theory. Like exactly. You can't have an evolutionary theory without that subjective motion of the creation of the narrative.
Absolutely right. I
think that's how I would think. And I think if I get it right, that in Less Than Nothing, Zizek makes this distinction between his version of Hegel and what he calls the Pittsburgh Hegelians, the liberal Hegelian.
Yeah.
And he was saying he's basically saying, what's the difference between the evolutionary complexity view of the universe and the deflated Hegel?
Right.
Basically trying to equate. So I think the distinction you're making here and the emphasis you're making here is something I just want to emphasize for the viewers, because I think it's an interesting one philosophically to go into.
Yeah, I agree. I find it infinitely fascinating.
Yeah. Super cool. So I think the next main thing I want to talk about is identity and difference, because also you could say in the contemporary philosophical tradition, a lot of people love Deleuze, of course. A lot of people emphasize difference, and that they often juxtapose Deleuzian difference and Hegelian identity. That Hegel is too much a thinker of identity and Deleuze breaks us out of this. But in my reading of Phenomenology of Spirit, this doesn't hold, because identity and difference are always at work together in Hegel. So what's your view? If you could give some sort of clarity on your understanding of identity and difference in Hegel, and how does it relate to more maybe postmodern notions of difference?
Yeah, so Hegel was Deleuze's great enemy. So he writes on a lot of different, he has books on a lot of different thinkers, none on Hegel, but pot shots at Hegel occur in almost all of his books. And I think that is right. He's right to attack Hegel, because I think not for the reason he thinks, but because I think you're right that Hegel is absolutely not a philosopher of identity in the way that Deleuze thinks he is. Instead, he's a philosopher of contradiction. And so when Deleuze sees contradiction, he wants to say that contradiction is hiding difference. And when Hegel sees difference, he wants to say that difference is hiding a contradiction. And so I think that to me, that's the basic fundamental split between them. And then I think you say you just have to pick a side. Okay, I think that's a little bit and that's so Alain Badiou is no friend of Deleuze. He wrote a terrible diatribe against him. He is still on Deleuze's side, that there just are differences, and there aren't, and that contradictions may erupt when these differences get at odds with each other, but they're not fundamental to the world, because they're just pure. It's a universe of pure difference. And so what's the problem with that? So and both Deleuze and Badiou, I think, believe that it's just axiomatic. You just have to choose. So it's just Either there are differences or there is one, they think. That's the opposition. But I think what Hegel would say is, no, we know because we are speaking beings that then run into these contradictions, which we've just detailed from the critique of pure reason, right? Like if you try to think things to their limit, we run into these contradictions. So their contradiction exists in our way of conceptualizing things. Now, and I think they would just say, well, that's an error of our way of conceptualizing things. But Hegel would say, no, that has to arise ontologically. It has to be possible. And I think for him, this is to me the really interesting aspect of his thought. And he gets this a lot from Kant. Like, how is it possible that these contradictions arise? And he says, well, there has to be an basic ontological contradiction for these epistemological contradictions to arise. And so for him, it's not an axiom of contradiction. He thinks he can prove it. So you don't have to, obviously, people don't have to accept that, but I accept that. I think that he does actually prove the existence of contradiction, doing something that we just talked about, starting from the end and going backward, not trying to start it. You can't start at the beginning, obviously, but starting at the end, looking backwards. What makes this possible? Well, the universe must be contradictory. Being itself must be contradictory. So I think that's, to me, both why Deleuze misses his target when he's shooting at Hegel, and I think that's my way of understanding the difference between them.
Yeah, it's again so fascinating because at a recent conference I presented in, me and another philosopher in our own way, we weren't directly talking about Hegel, but we were speaking about basically the ontology of contradiction and paradox. And this upset quite a number of people. There was an emotional reaction to the idea that contradiction and paradox were ontological.
Right.
I think that this does upset people.
I think it does because I think it troubles the ontology of pure differences, right? Like I think if you believe, because for one, it also upsets every identity. To get back to the question of identity, you are not just identical to yourself. If contradiction is fundamental, then you're also a being of contradiction, and then you don't have an identity that you can rely on. And I think today identity is important, not just for Trump supporters, but for a lot of people. I mean, it is for Trump supporters, and I think that's why a philosophy of contradiction is troubling.
Right. Yeah. And to me, if I take the notions of the one, or if I take the notions of the multiplicity, and I try to act out a practical life based on this notion, to me I run into contradiction.
I know. I agree with that. Yeah. So I think that this happens with Deleuze, right? And this philosophy of the multiple. I think that I think in the end, you can start, and I think what you said is really great, because not only can you get back to contradiction from the multiple, but if you play out the philosophy of multiplicity as a practice, you end up caught within contradictions.
Absolutely, that's been my experience. That's why I love the notion. I don't know how if you've gone into this yourself, I'd love for you to expand on it. I love this notion of the negative one, the square root of the negative one. Right. It appears in Alenka Zupančič, What is Sex, quite a lot. Mm-hmm. Just this note, and I think Lacan mentions it.
Yeah, Lacan loves the square root of negative one.
Yeah, and Lacan loves it. So to me, tell me if I'm flawed in my thinking with this. Okay. Is the negative one is a weird. It's not the synthesis in the silly way, right. but it's like a weird synthesis of the one and the multiple, because it means it's kind of like the existence of the non-existent other. Like it goes from like there is no other to there is a non-other.
Right.
To me, that's like the negative one, and so it's like the multiplicity is like there's a multiplicity of human subjects, but all of them are kind of tarrying with the negativity of the not one.
Right.
So I don't know what you think about that.
No, that's good. Yeah, I think that's good. I think that Slavoj talks about this move from the not human to let me talk about it in Lacan's terms.
Inhuman.
Yeah, right, right. The inhuman, right. That's what I was going to say. But I think it's clear in Lacan where Lacan says the difference between there is no sexual relation and there is a non-sexual relation. So, and I think that turn is what you're talking about with the square root of -1. Like it is the actual positive form of the absence. And I think I think there's so much to be gained from that form, right? Like that, because that's it's the way to imagine a kind of almost a universality or a solidarity within that figure of which doesn't function. And I think it was clear from what you're saying, it doesn't function like a master signifier that holds us all together because it's something that's missing altogether. And so I think that's I find that really important idea. Yeah.
It also, I'm getting frustrated in myself because I'm forgetting the name of your of a French psychoanalyst Lacanian that you interviewed, but do you remember the name?
Yeah, it's either Guy Legoffet or
yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Guy Legoffet. I love that conversation, by the way.
Yeah, he is amazing on this very question. He's really,
that's why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah. He actually has, so he has a book about the non-sexual relationship, which is very good and about logic. And then he has another book. It's only published in French. It's about omnipotence and this figure of the square root of -1. So but he just does it with the barred A, the non-existent other. And he talks about that in terms of our idea of omnipotence. So yeah, I think that I can't recommend Guy highly enough. He's a really smart guy. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really appreciated his view on sexual difference using geometrical terms like left and right.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he was articulating the sort of the non-relation and how Lacan comes. I just want to, yeah, if anyone wants to look that up on Todd McGowan's channel, it's a great conversation he had with Guy Legoffet. So
yeah, his English is really good too. I mean, he doesn't sound like, he sounds French, but he speaks really coherent English. So.
Right. So in your experience with this logic, what phenomena, say in our present universe, whether it's sort of the gender trouble or racial trouble or political trouble or all that identity wars, it seems like these concepts you're playing with are really important and like can help.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the one we were just talking about, like Black Lives Matter, is in a way, I think, trying to say there is a non-relation, right? Like that's I think it's really important to read and interpret certain political movements, like you're just saying, in terms of the way in which they relate to that the existence of a non-relation, because I think it gives us a way to think about a universal connection to that holds us all together and yet doesn't dominate us or make us or require identity. I think I think people are afraid when they think, oh, universality, that means we all have to be subjected to the same kind of identity. And I think that's why what this concept that we're describing is so important, or even Hegel's notion of contradiction. Like, I think to understand that as itself universal is really a way to get, to refigure and reconceptualize political struggle. So I think it's vitally important, not just philosophically, but politically as well.
Yeah, it seemed what I observe is, and I think it's like, for me, I'm not so much on the activist lens, but like sort of when I do pay attention to the discourse of the activist lens, what it seems to me is this is searching in some sense for a perfect identity or a clear identity, and like, I don't know if that makes sense. Like,
well, I think it's just like what you were talking about earlier with Freud and the romance, right? Like, there is, on the one hand, there's this understanding that the contradiction is enlivening, and then on the other hand, there's this like, oh, I'm seeking out some kind of harmony, right? So, or identity. So I think in every struggle we have whether it's a romantic struggle or a political struggle, we have this opposition. And so I think part of what it's incumbent upon us to try to do is to try to pull out the universal and the contradictory, and struggle against the way in which identity keeps getting inserted in there. So I think you're right that we can see identity and harmony coming, being part of that striving. But I think there's also this other side to it that I would want to highlight.
And from what you've been saying, I hadn't thought before our talk that I was going to bring this up, but because of what you've been saying, it reminds me of it. In Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel goes into telos, and he goes into the way in which, and I'm saying because you've already said it, is the way in which the end is present at the beginning.
Yeah.
Which I think is such a fascinating idea, and in romantic and political struggle, it's kind of like the end is present at the beginning, but you never find out about it until the end. So to speak. So what benefits? So this is the idea I've been playing with: is what benefits are there to making the end consciously at the beginning? Like instead of it, because Hegel says it you only find out about the end at the end, but you become aware at the end that it was already present at the beginning.
I don't think he thinks you can become aware of it. I don't think he does, because there's this famous line at the preface of Philosophy of Right, the owl of Minerva takes flight only with the falling of dusk. And I think he really believes that our practice, our activity, our acts are out ahead of our theorizing, so that you can't know at the beginning, even though the end is already there, you can't know it except at the end. So I think he does, unfortunately, and I agree with him, think that theory always comes too late to direct us politically, like to make conscious this thing that's unconscious within our striving. So I think that's just for him an acknowledgement. We talked before about how philosophy is in some ways the highest discipline for him, but this is an acknowledgement of its radical limitation. It cannot direct the world how to go.
Yeah, and that does seem, if we were to feed that back into the conversation about art and religion, I
Right.
wonder what
You're right. I mean, that's right.
You're identifying a pretty radical limitation.
Yeah. That's right. And I don't know that art and religion have that limitation, right? Like they're in certain way, they're able to anticipate things in a way that philosophy can't. So I think that's true. I mean, you can think about, sometimes in a bad way, like certain poetic ideas drive, national revolutions or what, like I think that happens all the time. So I think that it's an interesting way in which those other, and certainly religion we see today, the way it can be in the driver's seat on political activity. So that is a way to kind of bring philosophy back down relative to religion and art, for sure.
Yeah, and another thing that's popped into my head from what you were saying about how our practices and our activities are ahead of our theorizing, and kind of irreducibly so, is this might sound a little left field, but I had an experience on psychedelics where the vision that came to me was that I would have an experience that I would never be able to tell a story about. So obviously when I die, like, so say for example, we finish this conversation and I go out and take a walk and I get hit by a bus.
Right.
So I can't tell anyone about that story.
Right.
The experience is irreducible, and the confrontation with, like the way Hegel describes the confrontation with death, Right.
And
I think those lines are extremely powerful.
Yeah, that's why he calls death the absolute master, right? Like I think what you're saying is really good, that and I think that idea, and that I think there's a real heuristic in that. I think that the idea that something can be completely lost, and I think that's what's interesting is that I think that insight is within Hegel who's a philosopher who tries to bring everything within, but the notion that something can be completely lost, I think I think that is his, when he writes in the absolute knowing chapter of phenomenology, that to know something absolutely is also to know one's own limit. And then he says this fascinating line: to know one's limit is to know how to sacrifice oneself. So there's a way in which there's this gap in the absolute, and understanding that gap is kind of what you're talking about. Like there's this thing that's going to always escape. Like I could tell the story. I could have this story that I could never tell, right? I could have this experience that could completely be just lost. And I think that is like, to understand the position for that is part of what it means to understand the absolute.
And I think there's nothing that touches me deeper than this. There's no topic that touches me deeper than this, because there is a way in which knowledge and, like, you know, people on their search for knowledge, their drive for knowledge, that they want to include everything.
Yeah.
You know, we really have that drive deeply, you know, like, and of course in love and politics as well. No, like we want the whole other, or in political praxis, you know, in communist political, if it's more conservative, it's usually we want the whole nation.
Right.
And then on the communist end, you want the whole planet.
Right, for sure.
But we have to lose everything. So what is that? What is, you know, to me, am I off base by saying we have to make friends with loss? We have to see loss
exactly
as a friend?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. Yes. Mm. That loss is integral to whatever we have, right? Like that's I think that if you could just put it in a nutshell, like that seems to me one of the crucial ideas that Hegel is getting at. And that's contradictory, of course, right? Like that in order to gain, you have to lose. But I think that's absolutely true for him.
And kind of to bring us in a way full circle, like the image of Jesus on the cross.
Right.
In order to gain, you have to lose. I mean, there's extremely humiliating symbol, right? Human on the cross. And at the same time, he rises as infinite spirit. So right. there's this coincidence, weird coincidence between gain and loss here.
Absolutely right. Like that's what he sees. I think you're right that's what he sees in Christianity. And it's interesting how, and I think this is the way it's bastardized. Most forms of Christianity that I'm acquainted with, that I grew up with, the loss is just completely marginalized, right? Like it's all about the victory, and to take away the loss is to take away the satisfaction that any triumph brings, right? So that's, for Hegel, that's absolutely crucial to the Christian idea.
I mean, it seems to me that there's always this paradox between the individual, not necessarily individual, but like the original discovery of something and the institutionalization of that thing. So like Marx and Marxists,
right?
Like, or, you know, Foucault or Foucauldians, or like the original Christians and then Christianity. There's always this way in which it becomes its opposite somehow.
Right, you know? Right. I mean, it's interesting though, because I'm not sure that you can play that with Hegel, because his whole philosophy is about, you know, like this term we were talking about earlier, Nachträglichkeit, like how it ends up has to be part of, like, you're telling the story always from how it ends up. So I do take your point, of course, like can we hold Marx responsible for what happened in the Soviet Union? I mean, that would be, I don't know. I mean, I think probably not, but like, can we hold Hegel responsible for the way his philosophy was misinterpreted? I mean, probably not, but there are, like, his way of writing is part of that philosophy, and that allowed those misinterpretations. So I don't know about that. And in Christianity too, like, is Christ to blame for
no, I wouldn't. So I wasn't saying that we should blame. I'm not saying we should blame Christ or Marx or Foucault. What I'm saying is that when it becomes an institutional thing, it seems like the egos, that it's kind of like Lacan's critique of ego psychology and Freud.
Yeah.
It's like, you know what I mean? Like the egos build the institution, and then they're egos. So they build a certain, so if you discover the unconscious and then you cover up the unconscious with the ego psychology, it's kind of like, it's a weird thing that happens.
I do. I understand your point. I shouldn't have said blame, but what I mean is that maybe, I don't know. I mean, I generally agree with you. I generally agree. I think that's generally right.
Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm wrong.
No, here's the thing that I'm curious about. That there, I think it's, and I think Hegel would call this position to say that every institutionalization of a thing is the betrayal or the distortion or the loss of an idea or a project, right? I think he would call that a kind of beautiful soulism, right? Like I think for him, a thing has to really stand the test of making itself manifest, becoming institutionalized. And then if it can do that, then okay, that's what it is. But if it can only, like, if Marxism is only valid insofar as we're rebelling against all these terrible injustices, but once it has to, but it can never get in power itself, Hegel would say, well, you know what, that's not really a very good philosophy. And because his idea is that you cannot, and I think in many ways his philosophy is a critique of hysteria, that you cannot stay in this rebel position and constantly attack those in institutional power without taking up the burden yourself of saying, okay, I'm gonna run things, like I'm gonna take up that burden. And so I guess I am sympathetic to what you're saying, but I think that
I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's exactly what I was looking for, because I've just been playing with this idea and I don't know how to think it through in the way you just did. But I think that you're making the point that is satisfactory to me, which is that, like, it's easy to throw stones at the person in power, kind of thing. It's kind of cheap, especially if you're just sitting in your own room. Like, I have no responsibility. There's, like, I don't have a country on my back.
Right. I mean, once you're ever in charge of the thing, you're like, oh my God, this is,
yeah.
Even if you've taught, it's the same thing. Like, I remember when I was a student in the classroom, just going on like, oh, this guy is terrible. It's so boring. I mean, I could do this. But then once you get in front, you're like, wait a minute, this is terrible. Like, it's like you have to care. Like, you're like, oh my God, it's 2 hours. I have to get through this 2 hours. I don't have enough to get through. I mean, the first college class I taught, I ended after 22 minutes. It was like, it was an hour and a half class or whatever. And I just didn't have anything more. I just couldn't do it. And so from that point on, I was like, I have such respect for anyone who stands up in front of people and tries to just do something, And so I feel like that's a really, I think, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be critical, obviously, but it just means when you're critical, you also have to include in your criticism yourself taking power, right? Like, you have to include the ability for your position to become the position of power. And if you don't, then you're just hysterically reacting against power and never really taking on the burden yourself. I'm not saying you have to get into power. I'm just saying you have to accept, like, could this position operate as the position of power?
Well, I think that's one of the main criticisms that jumps out to me of postmodernism, is that it can only exist as kind of like a parasitical critique of power, like the center.
Absolutely.
Like, right. Always critiquing the center of power, but it can't itself occupy the center of power.
Right. I'm absolutely against this kind of like resistance always don't against the center. Like, let's all constantly deconstruct the center, for instance. Yeah. I think I just think it's not a tenable philosophy, because it needs someone else to play the heavy, right? Like, somebody else has to play the bad guy. And so you have to, and Hegel's whole thought is you have to include the bad guy within your position. You can't just puts that off on somebody else. So I think that's incredibly important, politically and theoretically.
Absolutely. And it kind of like reminds me of what you're saying about the transition from external contradiction to internal contradiction. Is like, you can't just have the bad guy outside of you. The bad guy's also got to be inside.
Has to be also within. Right. Like there's this concept in this, I love this novel. It's a novel by David Grossman called Sea Under Love. It's about second generation Holocaust survivor, and he has this concept. He calls it the LNIY, the little Nazi in you, and so that's the whole novel is about this conflict between the protagonist and the little Nazi in him. So I think that I really like that idea that that's the internalization of this external contradiction.
Yeah, I have a friend who actually says something super similar. It's like every morning I wake up and I have to get rid of the little fascist in my head.
That's good.
Yeah. But that's a super important point. I don't want to switch it too much away from Hegel in the last 5 minutes, but like I'm tempted to, because you emphasized, I think, a crucial point about hysteria and political power, and it made me think about Lacan's 4 discourses. You have the hysterical discourse, you have the university discourse, you have the master's discourse, and you have the analyst discourse, or the analyst discourse.
The analyst discourse, yeah.
Yeah. So in this, so like maybe just as an act of like creative thinking, like, so you can't just take the hysterical position, although the hysterical position has its truth.
Right.
But then you have to also somehow relationally position yourself with the discourses somehow.
Yeah, I think that's a really tough question. I think that I guess the answer is, and I think so. Hegel accuses. It's interesting. Lacan accuses Hegel of different things. So he accuses him of being the exemplar of the master's discourse and the exemplar of university discourse. So he's one or the other. I don't know. But I think the idea is that I think the real opposition today is between hysterical and university discourse. And so I feel like, he invented this fifth one, the capitalist discourse, not in Seminar 17, in a different lecture. And a lot of people have made a lot of hay about that, but let's leave that aside. I think that what you're saying is really good, that you have to in some way know how to operate between university discourse and the discourse of the hysteric, and not and understand how to go between them in order to use them to criticize each other, and maybe that's what the analyst discourse is all about. I mean, I think that maybe I would want to identify Hegel with the analyst discourse. I don't know, but I think that would be an interesting way to think of it, that you have to, I don't know, I just like what you're saying about having a kind of getting the proper relation between those two.
Well, I know the different discourses are brought out of me relationally. When I was doing my PhD, I feel like I was a hysteric against some of the university discourse.
Right.
But then of course, if I do my own YouTube channel work and I'm presenting like ideas on philosophy and stuff, well, then I'm kind of either the university or the master's discourse in some way. And then if I work as a therapist, I'm in the analyst mode. So you're jumping between discourses.
Right. I think it's wrong to think that there's a certain discourse that will emancipate us, right? Like let's just get into this proper discourse and then it'll all be fine. So I think that you're right to say it really is more a way of thinking about what we're operating in a certain time, and understanding what truth is, who's operating as the agent, what's the agent in this discourse, right? And then of course, what's the remainder? Because that's for him really for Lacan, the crucial thing, like what's being left out, and then what's the significance of what's left out.
With the remainder, are you bringing us to this notion of the object patio?
Right, for the
remainder,
for sure, yeah.
Like where is the object of desire?
Right. Like what's left out? What's necessarily left out in order for this discourse to constitute a whole? Which is, I think, again, gets back to what we're talking about with absolute knowing, right? Like this emphasis not just on everything that's included, but also on this thing that has to be left out.
It's so interesting because in my own like retroactive analysis of my own self, when I was in the hysterics discourse as a graduate student, one of my colleagues said to me once that the PhD supervisor is always pointing out what's there, and you're always pointing out what's not there. Isn't that? As I was like,
yeah, it's great.
Like so fun, great. so interesting. That's what I was doing spontaneously.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's a great example of those two discourses at odds with each other.
Oh man,
yeah,
that's so interesting. So, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed this. I've gotten a lot out of it.
Me too. It was great talking to you.
Cool. So maybe any final words on Emancipation After Hegel? Are we going to finally get our contradictory revolution?
Oh God.
No, maybe that's the wrong framing of the
No,
whole.
that's good. I'd like to leave it at that. I could fight for the contradictory revolution. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to end the broadcast now. So thank you so much again, Todd. And I hope we can do it again one day.
That'd be great. Thanks. Good talking to you.